All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Andrew Outen, and I'm the Historical Programs Manager for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's Lunch Bite Object Talk. The American Revolution Institute promotes knowledge and appreciation for the achievement of American independence by supporting advanced study, developing changing exhibitions, and other historical programs and tours, advocating for historic preservation, and providing resources to classrooms nationwide that benefit teachers, students, and scholars alike. Today's Lunch Bite features the Institute's Museum Collections and Operations Manager, Paul Newman, discussing a handkerchief commemorating the reign of King George III from our museum collections and the various depictions on the textile. Paul Newman is the Institute's Museum Collections and Operations Manager, having joined the professional staff here at Anderson House in 2021. Prior to that, he served on the interpretive staff of the United States Capitol here in Washington, D.C., as well as on the curatorial staff at the Regimental Museum of the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards in Edinburgh, Scotland. But before I hand things over to Paul, the usual housekeeping items are in order for our friends tuning in with us on Zoom today. Following the presentation, there will be a question and answer session, so please feel free to submit your questions for Paul at any point during the presentation, and we will do our best, as always, to incorporate them with our live audience questions. Should you have any technical related questions or comments, those can be submitted by using the chat function, and one of our staff members will be monitoring that throughout the program and will do their best to assist you. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming my colleague, Paul Newman.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Thank you, all of you, for joining me here today at Anderson House. A very good afternoon and warm welcome to our mansion. Double-sided printing, which sometimes makes it... There we go. That's right, I think. Good, good. Lovely. Well, yes, welcome, everybody. It's a real pleasure to talk about this fabulous textile item. Don't often get to talk about textiles, but yeah, actually, this is the second time I'm speaking about textiles in this year, I think. So something a little bit different for us. So the focus, as Andrew alluded to, is of this printed cotton handkerchief commemorating the reign of King George III of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, which dates to around July 1812. The item was purchased by the museum in 2018, and the handkerchief forms part of the Robert Charles Lawrence Ferguson collection. Now, the handkerchief is an important item in our collection for the reasons that it presents the British perspective of the American Revolution, and particularly the war. That this is presented from almost 30 years after the Peace of Paris was signed is interesting to place the American Revolution within the broader British long 18th century. So this is where I should say this was made in Britain for the British market, which very much dictates the presentation of the piece. Now, my argument regarding the handkerchief is that the narrative presented is important for the presentation of the Revolutionary War as a global war, and with it, the implications of multiple theatres of war on the overall strategic picture for the British. This, I believe, was understood at the time of the 1770s and 1780s, as well as in 1812, when the piece was manufactured. Speaking of manufacture, very fortunately, the piece tells us who the engravers were. So the extremely ornate design is the product of the engravers Reimer & Son in London. The engraving would have been made into a copper plate, which was then printed onto the intended face of the dyed cotton textile. Now, it's worth mentioning that this piece is packed with detail, and especially text, which is very, very minute, especially in person and to some degree on screen, which unfortunately that may prove difficult to read at times, but I would be happy to share any images of the piece for personal use And if you are interested in that, my email address is given at the end. We do have this digitized, but on our online catalog, we only have one main image. We haven't got all the various TIFF files online yet. So that is coming. But as I say, feel free to email me if you are interested in seeing some of these close-up shots of the piece for your reference. In the center of the printed textile is a portrait of King George III, under which is a blurb or preamble, which explains that what this document is presenting and how to read it. And it states the reign of George III from his ascension to the throne, October 23, 1760, to the present period. Now, this being, again, roughly July 1812, as identified in a few other elements of this piece. It goes on to say that the reign commences in the center of the plate, i.e. the portrait of George, close to the, and it says the close to the portrait of His Majesty. The years are distinctly marked off in the upper series of circles and are divided from one another by straight lines. They flow from the center beginning with 1760, 1761, and so on, to the circumference of the large circle. And the events are distinguished by each month as well as the year in which they occurred. And they are marked in chronological precision. Sadly, I found not always the case. But anyway, the thought was there. The inner series of circles contain an accurate account of the various administrations that have been formed during the reign of King George. And these go on to include positions such as Lord Mayors and Sheriffs of London. Now, all of that is a lot to digest, I'm sure, and I will return for a deep dive into these circles, which are the main focal point of this document later on in this presentation. Finally, at the bottom of the preamble is quite a charming piece, and it goes on to say, in an age abounding with warriors and senators, so we're starting to get a Roman connection, whose equals of the pages of history can scarcely produce, it is difficult to select the most suitable characters to adorn this design, or those that have been most active in the great events of our own time. But none seem to have diffused the rays of glory with greater splendor round the nation than Nelson and Wellington. Fame will transit to remote posterity the vigorous eloquence of Fox and Pitt, and exhibit them as patterns worthy their imitation. High praise indeed. And I'll come back to those gentlemen mentioned shortly. Now, the central element of the design of these circles are surrounded by a floral border, which consists of the representative plants of the three kingdoms that make up the United Kingdom. So we have a rose here for England, the thistle for Scotland, and the clover for Ireland. The border is broken up by alternating designs of King George III's royal motto surmounted by St. Edward's crown, which you see on screen right now, as well as George III's royal coat of arms, with the bearers here on either side. You have the lion on the left of the screen for England and the unicorn for Scotland on the right. Scotland is the only country with a mythical beast representing it, by the way. Just sort of say that. Now we come to these glorious profile portraits in the four corners of the piece, which were alluded to in the preamble. And they alternate between two civic figures and two military. Let's start with the military. So we have this lovely image of the Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson, first Viscount Nelson, dressed in his naval uniform. Nelson was one of Britain's most celebrated naval officers and one of the nation's great names from the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. Nelson, famed for his roles at the battles of the Nile and Trafalgar. And what's lovely with all of these illustrations is that you get a charming bust-length portrait. You'll then have their various titles associated with their person underneath in these scrolls, and then those flourishes are represented again with the flowers of the United Kingdom there. Then we have the Duke of Wellington, or as I should say at this point in time, Viscount Wellington, because again, this is from 1812. And right at the moment that this was produced, he was in command of British land forces in the Iberian Peninsula. And actually, he was about to begin the siege of Badajoz. I want to say. which begins that same month. Of course, he goes on to wider claim in his career, and the portrait featured here, or the full color portrait next to the likeness of Wellington on the handkerchief, is actually in our collection and is on display upstairs in the English drawing room. So nice to showcase that there. Now to the civilian figures, we have a portrait of Charles James Fox, and connecting back to that preamble that I mentioned earlier, we have the civil figures are represented as Roman senators, and behind each of them, we'll see a winged figure of fame coming up, blowing their trumpet. So often I mention here in the US how so much of America's iconography harks back to Rome and Greece. The British were no different. Of course, many other countries in Europe did the same, but it's not always, it's nice to be able to compare how these iconographies are being used, and this is a nice piece for that. Now, who was Mr. Fox? So he was a member of Parliament, a noted orator, and would serve as Britain's first foreign secretary in the history of the country. And then lastly, but certainly not least, we have William Pitt the Younger, so son of William Pitt the Elder, no surprise, perhaps. But William Pitt was the youngest prime minister in British history, served 2 times. His first stint was something like 16 years, immediately at the end of the Revolutionary War, the American Revolutionary War, through the French Revolutionary Wars, and into the beginning of the Napoleonic Wars. So he's and dies quite young, sadly. Now back to our circles, which very much, again, dominate the narrative here in this presentation and in the handkerchief itself. So I gave you that long preamble earlier of what these circles are trying to do. So we have 2 concentric circles. Now I've put on some arrows to try and help identify things. So what you get is under George again is that preamble, which the arrows are pointed to right now. So ignore that from this discussion of circles. The innermost circle begins here, right above George's head, above that crown, and it will go around and around. Now, this circle is all about what is referred to as ministers and public men of Great Britain, beginning 1760 with George III taking the throne and continuing up until July 1812. So this close-up view, here's the circle in question. You have a list here of some of the key posts in British civil service. You're looking at things like the Lord Mayors of London, sheriffs, Lord Lieutenants of Ireland, through to cabinet positions, First Lord of the Admiralty, up to First Lord of the Treasury, which is actually the position of what we call the Prime Minister, is actually the First Lord of the Treasury. So for a long period in British history, there was no Prime Minister as such. He was the First Lord of the Treasury, but ends up becoming the de facto Prime Minister. Anyway, but that's what's going on there. And along the way in these circles, you'll get key administrations marked out. So in this case, it says the Bute Ministry, and that will continue through this period. So from a high level, you can look at this document and see what you need to know, and you can then drill down and get even more detail, depending on exactly what you want to do at that moment. So the second circle here is then much more general events. You're looking at royal events, births, deaths, marriages of various royals connected with the British royal family, and some not so connected. You're getting international events, so of course wars, political events, general news. Some things are very much on a domestic front. Again, we're looking at Britain, so we're talking about British domestic front, various criminal cases, things like that. So it is a wide spectrum of events being discussed. And let's zoom in here. And that little arrow there pointing along the bottom of this general news circle, if I can call it that, you actually get 4 timelines following the lives of Nelson, who we've mentioned already. You then go completely differently and go into Napoleon Bonaparte, because he's the great boogeyman of British history. And of course, as we know, the movie's coming out this week, and the passion for Napoleon hasn't really ebbed in any way, even though he was at least the British bad guy. And I won't get into the ins and outs of Napoleon. But he's a great character to love and hate, so much so that the British, in a document that's quite pro-monarch, is charting the life out quite in detail for Napoleon. And this is before Waterloo, so we haven't even beaten him yet, which is kind of interesting. Anyway, I did say we, but anyway. I can thank the Prussians later. Oh yeah, so you get Wellington. You don't actually get Wellington, he gets missed off the timelines, but then you get Fox and Pitt being mentioned over this long period of time. Oh, and just like how in the political circle you get the administrations being mentioned in large bold text, in the general news circle you'll get things like here the German War, they're meaning the 7 Years' War. You'll get that for the American Revolution and other big prominent usually wars with this particular circle. Now, of course, we are the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati, so I must pay particular attention to how the revolution, the American Revolution that is being portrayed. We have quite a few revolutions being mentioned in this document, so I'll try and be good and say American Revolution. Straight away, it starts off with, in the words of this document, the Americans deny the British the right to tax them. This is 1774. This is the first time we're seeing a mention of what's becoming the American Revolution. I flipped it up to give you a bit of perspective of reading it, and what you then go into is deputies meeting in Congress at Philadelphia. Quite a fun turn of phrase. What they're referring to is the First Continental Congress. This happening at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia in September and October 1774. Congress will petition the king, which is being mentioned here. I keep looking. Yeah, so 1775, pretty much the standard affair. You've got Lexington Concord, the first firefight of the war. You're getting Bunker Hill. So a standard narrative, you could say. Going into 1776 and 7, this is when it starts to get quite interesting. We're deviating away from, certainly in the US, what would be a typical narrative. We're getting one of the most colorful stories of the American Revolution. John the Painter. Now, I don't know about you. I did not know about John the Painter until I came across our handkerchief. John the Painter, whose real name was John Aitken, was a Scottish painter, and he becomes known as the Painter. And as it says here in quite this emboldened typeface, he led a firebombing campaign of British naval dockyards during the Revolution. So this is not great if you're on the receiving end, but fascinating stuff. So he led what we would today call a domestic terrorism campaign, a sabotage campaign aimed at crippling British naval dockyards. He believed he was given permission by the Congress to do this, as well as Silas Deane. He actually met with Silas Deane. Silas Deane was actually horrified when he found out what was going on. He doesn't seem to have received the permission of anyone in the US to do this. And he was on his own doing it, though at the time Britain believed there was a gang of them doing this because he was hitting different dockyards. I mentioned he was a painter. He used his painting knowledge to actually mix chemicals to create firebombs. And he was going to Portsmouth and Bristol and other places, and did cause quite a bit of damage. And his whole motive was to cripple the Navy. And something will come up time and time again is the importance of the Navy being represented in this document. Oh, and I should say that Mr. Aitken immigrated to the US in about 75. He apparently gets indoctrinated with revolutionary fervor, and then I think gets in trouble legally in America. He's always on the wrong side of the law everywhere he lives. And then he comes back to the UK and starts his bombing campaign. So quite interesting, quite interesting. And that's what is dominating this little period here. And the period where they stopped talking about him is when he was publicly executed in England in front of 20,000 spectators for being a traitor. So good stuff. Good stuff. He's put on the highest gallows in British history, which was the mast from a warship. Anyway, it just keeps on going. And that is really an excellent, just one little case study is typical of what you're seeing on this document. Things that you've never heard of, things that you may have heard of a little bit and make sense. And again, a lot of this is very much, it's all the British perspective. So some of it obviously makes a bit more sense if you're aware of their imperial history, but then there's other things like this that have maybe been forgotten along the way. 1778, this is when it really gets interesting, of course, because that's when the French come. Shame. But you get the mention here of the death of William Pitt the Elder, a longtime friend of the American colonies turned United States. He passes away here at age 70, and of course, a towering figure in British politics. We get the Battle of Ushant, about 100 nautical miles west of northwest France, off the island of Ushant. And this is the first naval clash of British and French forces in the war. Now, it proves to be indecisive, but on this one day, you've got roughly 30 ships on the French side, roughly 30 ships on the British side. So these are huge fleets. Remember that about every ship is at least about 500 men to up to 1,000 men. So this is not your Lexington and Concords of the world. This is an absolutely enormous slugging match. But for various reasons, it becomes indecisive, but it leads to much controversy in both the UK and France. I say UK, we weren't called the UK at that point. But anyway, not till a few years later. We get West Indies being talked about greatly. We've got several moments here. We get St. Lucia being captured from the French by the British, which is a really stirring action. We've got the French taking various islands like Dominica from the British in the Leeward Islands. So that's very prominent there. India is now starting to crop up. We've got the beginnings of the Second Anglo-Maratha War, which is the French aren't necessarily directly involved, but are indirectly in this campaign. This is very much now the global war. It's the war of empire. In this case, this is happening all in the Carnatic in the Southeast Indian Peninsula. We get a bit more of India in 1779. We have this huge statement here of Hyder Ali ravages the Carnatic with 100,000 men. Now with my own research, it was about 80,000 men, so not far off, and that's an enormous force. He initiates what becomes the Second Anglo-Mysore War, and Hyder Ali becomes unofficially an ally of the American states, so much so there was a privateer named after him from Pennsylvania that fights quite successfully. And this is very much pulling in the British even more into India than maybe they wanted to be. And this is a war that will last about 5 years and lead eventually to the third and final Mysore War, which Wellington, who we mentioned earlier, was involved in. In 1780, we get a little bit of Gibraltar. I'm trying not to talk about Gibraltar because I talk about it a lot. But that was the largest action on land in the revolution. So that's getting mentioned there. Though considering what a big affair it was in British history, doesn't get a lot of billing here. Again, it's a lot of the more distant and naval kind of actions being talked about a lot. But it has this really, oh yeah, the Dutch. Don't forget the Dutch. The Dutch come in. Again, not a lot talked about, but this is actually them at fighting the British fleet at Dogger Bank. So the Dutch very much are involved. They gave the first loan in history to the United States. Now in the middle there, oh yeah, the big arrow. That is, so every now and then throughout these circles, you're getting statistics of British land and sea forces. So in 1780, they provide this little snapshot. And on land, they have about 35,000 troops. At sea, 85,000 troops. What's useful with this document is that because we're looking at this long 18th century approach, you can look at 1812 when the document was produced, and it's giving a current up-to-date estimate of British forces. And we go from 35,000 land-based personnel to 340,000 by 1812 in the thick of the Napoleonic Wars. Sea forces are roughly doubled, or just under doubled to 145,000. in 1812, there are more British servicemen serving in the West Indies than served in all of the American colonies in the American Revolutionary War. And that's the West Indies, which was kind of certainly seen by the personnel as a backwater for many different reasons. And I'll come back to that statistic of the difference there in numbers and maybe what that means on the British psyche in a little while. So we, of course, 1781 into 2, we've got the surrender of Yorktown being mentioned. So there's very much those key bookends being talked about, what we consider maybe the bookends of the war. But in the very beginning of 1782, we have this swath of British defeats in the Caribbean. So this is after Yorktown, which often considered as the end of the war, at least militarily, but certainly not the case. We've got these swathe of defeats in the Caribbean. Remember, the Caribbean is where Britain and France are making the money that they need to power all of this in the first place. They also lose Minorca in the Caribbean, which was one of Spain's key war aims for even getting involved in the war. They said to France, if we can take Minorca, if we can take Gibraltar, we'll join you, because the French wanted the Spanish Navy to assist. So this is all coming back around to the reason that these powers are involved in the first place. Of course I put arrows. So sorry, Andrew, for all the arrows. And then the last mention of this war is in 1783. We've got these mentions of the peace treaties, of course, but in the center dominating this year are the words, "Thus war lost England thousands of lives and the greatest part of America, and cost 150 million pounds. That's 150 million pounds in 1783. So that is the lasting impression of this war in this document, which is quite telling. Now to conclude, the commemorative handkerchief that I have featured here presents many events associated with the American Revolution that today would be familiar to many Americans, as well as others that would fall under the global war narrative. We see battles in India, the Caribbean, and in Europe. Many of these actions involve the impact, or at least influence, of naval forces. Though this artifact dates to almost 30 years after the end of the American Revolutionary War, I would argue that what is being highlighted is illustrative to how the British administration and British society at large during the American Revolution understood the world as a series of fronts interconnected, with the outcome of battle in one affecting another, and in some instances having even greater importance than that of North America. Finally, I am routinely asked, what do the British learn about the American Revolution? And I typically respond with, we don't. Now, this is only my personal experiences, and so doesn't represent the experiences of every British person. But this handkerchief, I would argue, highlights how the American Revolution is overshadowed by the larger, costlier French Revolutionary War than Napoleonic Wars. And as shown in this item, are full of national figures that are commemorated to this day in the United Kingdom. Thank you. And any questions? Yes.
Yes, I'm wondering about the use of a handkerchief like that. Was it used for around someone's neck, literally, or is it an art sort of?
Yes, good question. So how was a handkerchief such as this, especially the size of it, was used contemporaneously to its production? So it certainly was commemorative. It would, in theory, someone could have worn it. It could have been a way of saying that you were a supporter of the monarch, King George III, and the British administration at that time. Certainly, there's a long history of things like that being worn in France and the UK to connect and announce your political leanings. So I can imagine that being the case. But I think in the main that this would have been a commemorative piece that you would have hung at home, probably in a frame, which certainly, as time moves on, that's how we often find these pieces. Certainly later generations, the Victorians and so on, are framing these kind of decorative textiles to hang in their home. Yes, sir.
Price-wise, who was buying this? Is this something that is obtained only by a very rare group of people with a lot of money, or is this something that's meant for the average person to be able to have as well?
Good question. Good question. So, who would have been buying a piece like this in, say, 1812? So I don't know categorically, but I believe it was aimed at the more affluent individuals. Certainly, you can imagine men and women of taste. Now, in that case, that's meaning to have the money to have taste. And I mean that in no derogatory sense. I just mean in the sense that if you're a working class baker, you can't afford silks and whatnot. And actually, some of these were made of silk. This one is made of cotton, but I think the V&A has one made of silk, which we're quite lucky that this isn't, because it makes it a lot easier to handle and store, and maybe is the reason why the colors have survived so well. So these were made in both silk and cotton.
You had to be able to read, for one thing.
Yes, you did indeed have to read. Yes.
My other question, and Iris may know the answer to this as well. You said that the first loan came from the Dutch.
Mm.
Did they ever get paid back?
Gosh, did the Dutch ever get paid back? I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure. Oh, they did. Oh, they did. Good. Oh, the French didn't, but the Dutch did. That's interesting. Yeah, and so and I didn't really get into it, but when the Dutch get involved and go against the British, that becomes what's known as the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, which is kind of the last throes of kind of the Dutch imperial history in a way, at least in a European sense. Yes, any other questions in person? Otherwise, we'll go to Zoom. Yes.
Story was just it's quite the selection of what you put there and not interesting.
Yes, and so so what do we know? Was this commissioned? Who's making the choices to create this story, create this narrative, which, as you see, I'm arguing is showing a certain narrative, which I think this does. But of course, that's the result of who's put that there or who've made these decisions. Have no idea, sadly, at this point. Maybe with further research, we can understand. Certainly, it's very much a pro-George Hanoverian monarchy leaning. It's pro though it's interesting, you've got a few different administrations represented by some of the characters, but it's certainly a nationalistic, pro kind of British mercantile imperial leanings, which is certainly not difficult to find in these periods. You'd be hard pressed to find a different opinion. But yes, no idea, sadly. Yes. So Andrew from Zoom. Gosh, so the question was, did I allude to the British not learning from the American Revolution? I don't know if that's really what I'm saying, but well, I didn't really say either way, but to answer that in a way, in an indirect way, is I would say they do, in as much as they then, at least this document is really trumping up the successes of the later wars against France, which they don't break down what they're learning in a militaristic sense or financial framework as well, that's allowing some of these things to happen to Britain to expand its army so ridiculously in a short space of time. So that I feel like is for another day. French and Indian War. So this document doesn't, I feel like I can't really extrapolate lessons learned from the French and Indian War that lead to the American Revolutionary War in this. You could allude to some of it, maybe, but you'd be hard pressed to do that. I think, yeah, I would be hard pressed to argue one way or the other with those areas in this particular document. Though you could say, you can certainly see. Yeah, I don't know. I'll think about that. Yeah, hard pressed to answer that with this particular document. Though I could argue it in other ways another time. Oh, do we have any other objects that portray the British perspective in the American Revolutionary War? Yes, we do. So nothing quite like this. This is we have a very small textile collection. That being said, we have a wide variety of objects. One of the most interesting is regarding the loyalists. So not British regular forces per se, but it's a loyalist. It's an engraved powder horn that is has a map of New York State, with various locations, a lot of the military forts, as well as town centers and cities. And it has a very, very large British royal coat of arms, and it has a motto basically exclaiming loyalty to the king. So we have nothing like this in that it literally tells you everything you kind of need to know, but you have these objects that speak to the various passions, whether it's loyalists or, and this goes across the range of some of the different belligerent nations that we represent. But we have that. We have a fantastic portrait of a loyalist, and then that's James Delancey. I think James Delancey, who's fascinating, immigrates to Canada. And then what else do we have that I was thinking about? So more so probably in the library side of things that would actually give voice to these various arguments and discussions that are happening. My brain straight away goes to the museum because I'm on the museum side, and the library, if you want to delve into that, I would definitely urge you to look at our digital library on our website and our library catalog, as well as the museum catalog. But certainly, if you wanted to email me more, I could think about that more and maybe point you in the right direction.
I have a royal land grant dated 1773 the 3rd of Great Britain, France, and Ireland. What's the French connection?
Oh, that is it. So the question was that a particular viewer has a land grant in their possession from 1773, did you say? Yeah. That references, so it's from the King George III, and it mentions that he's the King of Great Britain, France, and Ireland. So France is a good point to mention. France had been, or quote unquote, France was claimed by the British royal family, stretching back to the medieval period, I think 100 Years' War. And the British, under various different families, laid claim to this based on marriage connections and other political connections, did rule chunks of what is now France at various times. And for many, many decades and centuries after, the British had been actually ousted out of what's now France. They still had claims to those. And I think I want to say George III might be the last monarch, I think, to have any kind of allusions to that title. But then to this day, I think we still have the fleur-de-lis represented in the British Royal Coat of Arms.
Terms of the Treaty of Amiens, Napoleon.
Oh, okay.
The British gave up the title of King of France.
Oh, thank you. No, one of our guests in person mentioned that the Treaty of Amiens in 1801, which then leads to a brief secession in fighting with Napoleon's France, that as part of that, the King of Britain had to go away from this title of King of France. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I hope that answers them. Lovely. Well, I will leave it there. For those of you in person, certainly come and see our handkerchief. Again, anyone else, feel free to email me after this and we can discuss more about this and other items in the collection. But thank you for joining us.